Welcome back to The Deep Dive. Today we're diving into the world of ESG investing with Vivek Ramaswamy's Capitalist Punishment. Get ready, because we're about to explore whether this financial giant is the hero or villain of the investing world.
It's fascinating how ESG has taken center stage in the finance world. Yet, there's a lot of mystery surrounding how it actually plays out in the real world.
It's like everyone's throwing around ESG like it's the hottest stock tip, but few can explain what it really means beyond the catchy acronym.
Exactly. Ramaswamy tackles this head-on in Capitalist Punishment. He doesn't just define ESG environmental, social, and governance. He digs into its soul.
He paints a picture of this battle between two titans. The classic shareholder capitalism championed by Milton Friedman and the newer stakeholder capitalism advocated by Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum.
Right, it's a clash of ideologies. Friedman argued that a corporation's primary duty is to its shareholders to maximize their profits. But Schwab sees a bigger picture, where corporations are accountable to a wider circle, employees, customers, communities, the whole shebang.
So where does ESG fit into this corporate showdown?
ESG is basically the rule book for stakeholder capitalism. It gives companies a way to measure their performance on things like environmental impact, social responsibility, and how they govern themselves, in addition to just their financial performance.
Okay, so it's about companies being good citizens, not just profit machines. But does doing good actually translate into higher returns for investors? That's the million-dollar question, right?
And Ramaswamy tackles it head-on, highlighting both the alluring promises of ESG and some pretty glaring contradictions.
Let's start with the positive side. Why is ESG gaining so much traction, especially among younger investors?
It's simple. People are waking up to the world around them. Climate change, social injustice, income inequality. These aren't just headlines anymore, they're personal. More and more people want their investments to reflect their values. They're tired of profiting off companies that harm the planet or exploit people.
And Wall Street, never one to miss an opportunity, sees a chance to cash in on this ethical awakening.
You're right. Absolutely. ESG has become a powerful marketing tool. We see funds labeled ESG everywhere. But as Ramaswamy points out, there's a dark side to this ethical investing craze.
He calls out some serious concerns, particularly regarding transparency and potential conflicts of interest. Can you give us a taste of what he uncovers?
Take Pax World Management, for example. They were pioneers in ESG investing, marketing their funds as ethically sound. But they got hit with a hefty SEC fine for misleading investors. Turns out they were invested in industries like alcohol, gambling, and even military contracting, not exactly the image of ethical investing they were promoting.
Talk about saying one thing and doing another. That's greenwashing at its finest, right? Making promises of ethical investing while quietly lining their pockets with profits from industries that contradict those very values.
And it gets even more complex with the rise of index funds, which Ramaswamy links to the story of Jack Bogle and his quest to democratize investing.
Jack Bogle, the legend who founded Vanguard and basically handed Wall Street its lunch money by introducing index funds. His philosophy was about giving everyday investors access to the market with low fees.
Exactly. Bogle's index funds were a game changer. They've exploded in popularity, driving down fees across the board. But this shift towards passive investing, while great for individual investors, has also had unintended consequences for the ESG landscape.
How so? I'm all ears.
Well, it's created this massive concentration of power in the hands of a few giant asset managers like BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, the big three. These titans now control trillions of dollars in assets.
That's more money than some countries.
And because index funds automatically buy up all the stocks in a specific index, these asset managers have become the largest shareholders in almost every major company. That gives them enormous voting power on everything from who sits on corporate boards to which shareholder proposals pass.
So while we're cheering for low fees and easy investing, these behemoths are quietly amassing influence.
And remember, these asset managers have all publicly committed to using their clout to push ESG goals. So even if you're not intentionally picking ESG-focused funds, if you're in an index fund, your money might be fueling that ESG engine, whether you agree with it or not.
It's like unknowingly signing a petition.
That's precisely what Ramaswamy calls green smuggling, sneaking ESG into investment strategies without explicit investor consent.
Sneaky. But where does this leave the whole concept of fiduciary duty? Don't these fund managers have a legal obligation to act in the best financial interests of their clients?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Can they truly serve two masters maximizing returns for their investors and simultaneously pushing an ethical agenda.
It seems like a recipe for potential conflicts of interest.
Exactly. And Ramaswamy argues that in many cases, those two objectives are fundamentally at odds, and he uses some pretty compelling examples to make his point.
Okay, spill the tea. What examples does he give?
Well, he talks about Chevron and a proposal requiring them to adopt Scope 3 emissions standards.
Scope 3. For those of us who don't speak fluent corporate jargon, what does that even mean?
Scope 3 emissions are basically all the indirect emissions that come from a company's value chain, including emissions from their products being used by customers.
Ah, so holding them accountable for how their products are used out in the real world, not just in their own backyard, that's a pretty big deal.
Exactly. And Chevron's board wasn't thrilled about it. They argued against the proposal, but guess who voted in favor of it? BlackRock and State Street.
The ESG champions themselves.
Exactly. And their votes were enough to push the proposal through.
So we have these giant asset managers who are supposed to be looking out for their clients' financial well-being, potentially sacrificing returns to advance a social agenda.
It really highlights the tension between generating profits and promoting potentially costly social goals.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg. This conflict between ESG goals and fiduciary duty pops up again and again throughout Ramaswamy's analysis. And it begs the question, who's really calling the shots when it comes to our investments? Is it us, the investors, or these financial titans with their own agendas? Ramaswamy doesn't hold back, does he? He really takes aim at the big three and how much power they've gathered.
He does. He even goes as far as to call it, get this, the biggest antitrust violation in history.
Wow. Okay, so we were talking about conflicts of interest before, and now we're talking about antitrust violations. That's a big jump.
Well, he's arguing that when you have these massive asset managers like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, who control such a huge chunk of the market.
We said trillions of dollars.
Trillions, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And because they own so much, he's saying they can basically dictate terms to entire industries.
So it's not just about what they choose to invest in, it's about them having the power to potentially crush any company that doesn't play by their rules.
Right, like if they decide they want to push a certain agenda, say net zero emissions, they can use their voting power to force companies to adopt those policies, even if it hurts the company's bottom line.
Which brings us back to that whole fiduciary duty thing, right? If they're so busy pushing their own agenda, how can they possibly be acting in the best interests of their investors who might not all agree with those goals?
Exactly. And he gives that example of Chevron.
Right, the oil giant.
So there was a shareholder proposal to force Chevron to adopt stricter emissions standards.
Which Chevron obviously wasn't too keen on.
No, they argued against it, said it would hurt their business, but guess who voted in favor of it?
BlackRock and State Street.
Bingo. And their votes were enough to push it through.
So it's like they're saying, we don't care if this hurts your profits, we're going to make you do it anyway because we think it's the right thing to do.
And that's where it gets really tricky. Who gets to decide what the right thing is?
Especially when you're talking about people's investments, their retirement savings. This isn't just some theoretical debate, this is real money at stake.
Exactly. And Ramaswamy argues that this whole ESG push is creating a lot of unintended consequences.
Like what?
Well, he talks about how it's contributing to higher energy prices.
Because the push for renewables is happening too fast.
He says it's pushing away from traditional energy sources before we have viable alternatives in place.
And he also points to that whole FTX debacle as an example of how ESG can be used as a smokescreen.
Oh yeah, that was a wild one. FTX, the cryptocurrency exchange, they were all over the news, slapping their name on everything, pushing their ESG credentials.
And then it all came crashing down. Turns out they were engaged in some seriously shady business practices.
Yeah, and a lot of people got burned. So it makes you wonder, are these companies really as virtuous as they claim to be, or are they just using ESG as a marketing ploy?
Right. It's like that old saying, if it seems too good to be true.
It probably is.
Exactly. So where do we go from here? If this ESG thing is as problematic as Ramaswamy claims, what are the solutions?
Well, he's a big proponent of transparency. He thinks investors should have a lot more visibility into how their money is being voted, what kind of shareholder proposals are being supported.
So like being able to see, okay, my index fund voted this way on this issue.
Exactly. And he also talks about the need for alternative investment vehicles.
Like his own firm, Strive.
Right, which is explicitly marketed as an alternative to the ESG heavyweights.
So giving people a choice.
Right, because right now it's like you're either on the ESG train or you're left at the station.
And he's saying that shouldn't be the case. You should be able to invest in a way that aligns with your values, even if those values don't perfectly match the ESG playbook.
Exactly. He also dives into this whole legal side of things.
Oh, yeah, he mentioned something about compelled speech in the First Amendment.
He argues that when pension funds, which are often managed by government entities, use their power to push ESG, they're essentially forcing their members to support those causes, even if they disagree.
So, like, you're forced to pay into the pension fund, and then they take your money and use it to support causes you might be opposed to.
Exactly. And he says that raises serious constitutional questions.
That's wild. So he's basically saying that ESG, as it's currently practiced, might actually be unconstitutional.
He makes a strong case for it. It'll be interesting to see how this all plays out in the courts.
This is getting heavy. We've gone from ESG being a force for good to potentially being unconstitutional.
Right. It's a lot more complicated than it seems at first glance.
That's for sure. It's a lot to unpack. On one hand, you have this movement pushing for a more ethical and sustainable future, but on the other, you have these potential downsides like lack of transparency, potential conflicts of interest, and even questions about whether it's truly effective. It's enough to make your head spin.
And that's precisely why Ramaswamy's book is such a crucial read. It's not about taking sides for or against ESG, but about understanding the complexities and nuances of this movement that's reshaping the financial world as we know it.
He doesn't just point out the problems, he actually offers some potential solutions, right?
Yeah, absolutely. He's a big advocate for greater transparency and accountability. He believes that investors have a right to know how their money is being voted, which companies their funds are supporting, and how those companies align with their values.
That makes sense. Knowledge is power, after all.
Exactly. The more informed we are as investors, the better equipped we are to make decisions that align with our values. He also suggests exploring alternative investment vehicles, like his own firm, Strive Asset Management, which prioritizes excellence over politics.
So it's about having choices, right? Not just being spoon-fed a particular agenda, even if it's well-intentioned.
Exactly. He believes that a truly free market needs diverse options, allowing investors to choose what aligns best with their values and financial goals.
And what about this idea of compelled speech that he keeps bringing up? How does that play into all of this?
It's a really interesting point he makes. He argues that when pension funds, often managed by government entities, use their voting power to advance ESG goals, they're essentially forcing their members, that's you and me, by the way, to financially support those goals, even if we disagree with them.
That's a pretty bold claim. Is that even legal?
He points to several court cases where individuals challenged the use of their money for causes they opposed and actually won. He argues that the same principle should apply to how our pension funds are voting.
So it's about individual freedom and the right to choose, even when it comes to our investments.
Exactly. And he takes it a step further, arguing that being forced to be a member of a pension fund that actively promotes views you disagree with violates your right to freedom of association, a right implied by the First Amendment.
It's like being forced to join a club that you fundamentally disagree with.
Precisely. He argues that these are serious constitutional questions that need to be addressed, particularly as ESG becomes increasingly intertwined with government policy.
It sounds like Ramaswamy is issuing a call to action for investors everywhere.
He is. He encourages everyone to educate themselves about how their money is being invested, to ask tough questions about proxy voting and shareholder proposals, and to make their voices heard by contacting their fund managers and elected officials.
Don't just be a passive bystander in this ESG revolution. Get informed, get engaged, and make sure your investments are truly aligned with your values.
That's the key takeaway here. It's not about blindly following the ESG bandwagon, but about making conscious, informed decisions that reflect what you believe in.
And that's what this deep dive has been all about, giving you the tools and the knowledge to navigate the complex and often contradictory world of ESG investing. We've explored its promises and its pitfalls, its champions and its critics, its potential to do good, and its potential to cause harm.
It's a nuanced conversation, and there are no easy answers. But one thing's for sure, as ESG continues to reshape the financial landscape, it's a conversation we can't afford to ignore.
So, what will you do with this newfound knowledge? Will you take a closer look at your own investments? Will you start asking tough questions? Will you demand more transparency and accountability from the financial institutions entrusted with your hard-earned money?
The power ultimately lies in your hands. As for us, we'll keep diving deep into the world of finance, bringing you thought-provoking insights and analysis to help you make sense of it all.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and as always, happy investing.